Ready one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with my reaction to week 1 of Can You Forgive Steve Donoghue, the Trollope read-along. In other words, this is the first 20 chapters of the Anthony Trollope novel, Can You Forgive Her? Hashtag Can You Forgive Steve Donoghue? Go me! So he's asked anybody who's participating who has a BookTube channel to do a reaction video. So here I am. But he said that if we were all sitting in the same room over calzones? I always thought it was calzones. I think he said calzones. And wine. So I've never really learned what calzones are. Some kind of Mexican food, or is it the Spanish word for testicles? Anyway, whatever it is, I do have wine. He's given a list of some questions to get us started. The first one is, who, in terms of the characters in Can You Forgive Her, did you like and dislike? I'm going to put that one at the end. The others make more sense to me as kind of an introduction, and then I'll kind of move into my reaction to the first chunk of the novel by using that question about characters I like and dislike as a jumping off point. How am I reading this book? I am doing this as my infamous audio text combo. So I am listening to it on audio, narrated by the inimitable David Shaw Parker. See my Friday Reads video for a little mishap I had with trying to excerpt from the audiobook. That didn't go over very well. While I follow along on the free book that Steve pointed us towards from Gutenberg Project, they have free downloads, so I'm reading it and listening to it 97% of the time in tandem. Occasionally, if I'm walking, I will listen to the audio without the benefit of the text, but almost all of it I'm doing sitting here at home or on the train or in a cafe, reading and listening at the same time, and it's just marvelous. Am I keeping notes as I go along? No, I'm not, but in the Kindle I am highlighting stuff, and occasionally I'll type a note, but mostly just highlighting quotes that I like or that I want to think about more. Is it my first Victorian novel? No, I would consider myself fairly widely read in Victorian fiction, mostly at university. And then, is it my first Trollope novel? No, my first Trollope novel was an obscure one. My undergrad Victorian novel class, the professor, he was old. He was probably 70 or something. And I think he was getting bored of teaching the same novels. So instead of doing the Barsetshire novel or one of the famous ones, we read several obscure novels by the canonical writers. And so we read Is He Popenjoy? And it wasn't, I can see now it wasn't his best, but I loved it. It was my first exposure to Anthony Trollope, and I absolutely loved it. So that was my first, and then I read, I can't remember exact order, but since I've lived in Japan, I've read 2. I believe the first one was, what is it called? The Chronicles of Barsetshire? I believe that's the title, and I didn't like it. I thought it was too much Anglican, churchy religion stuff. Parts of it I liked, but it was a little disappointing. But then I read one of his later novels, The Way We Live Now, and it was just, it's one of my favorite Victorian novels. I absolutely loved it. So no, I really love Anthony Trollope. And so I jumped at the chance to read this, the first of the Palliser novels. So those are my responses to his questions. Which characters did I like and dislike? So this is the story of, at least so far, the main character seems to be Alice Vavasor, who comes from a mixed marriage of upper class and kind of lower upper class or upper middle class. The Vavasors, they were looked down upon by the upper class, but Alice Vavasor's father is, Steve described his character very well, but her mother is dead, but she was from the upper class. And as Steve explains in his video, and he does a masterful job, and I'm not going to try to cover any ground that he's covered, the rich relatives, and I love the way that Trollope described, I think it's really in the very first chapter, on the first page, the way he describes the dynamic between the Vavasors and Alice's mother's family, and just the phrases he used to show, like the powers that be. I can't remember the phrase, it doesn't matter now, but you should go and read it. As Steve points out, when Alice's mother dies, the rich family who hate her husband, Mr. Vavasor, they settle all of the inheritance on Alice herself. She is independently wealthy. Steve asked, which characters did you like? So I actually liked Alice better than Steve seems to. Now, Steve said he didn't say he hated her, but I find her fascinating. She's not like an Austen heroine where she has a full, lovable personality. She doesn't. But I love her ferocity and her independence. I'm trying to think of another Victorian heroine that she would remind me of. She's more Hardy-esque maybe than Austenian. And I don't remember another Trollope heroine quite as feisty as she is. So one of her relatives is Lady MacLeod. And Lady MacLeod has pretensions to be accepted by the upper class members of her family, but they just barely put up with her. But she's kind of a conduit between them and Alice, because Alice has no patience or use for her upper class relatives whatsoever, and has barely met any of them. But as she is contemplating breaking off the engagement with Mr. Grey, I loved what she said to Lady MacLeod. So this is one of my favorite quotes of the first 20 chapters. I just have 2 quotes to read to you. People always do seem to think it so terrible that a girl should have her own way in anything. She mustn't like anyone at first, and then, when she does like someone, she must marry him directly she's bidden. I haven't much of my own way at present, but you see, when I'm married I shan't have it at all. You can't wonder that I shouldn't be in a hurry. So to me that's a great example of Alice just calling it as she sees it, and here she's kind of toying with the idea of at least delaying the wedding, but eventually, as we find out, she breaks off the engagement. But this is the beginning of her kind of articulating kind of a proto-feminist stance on the bullshit that the marriage plot was for women in the 19th century. And I don't love her, she's not lovable, but I really, really like her. I like where her character seems to be going in this novel. But this novel is so hilarious in places. So for me, the pee my pants part was when Alice's cousin Kate Vavasor goes with Aunt Greenough to Yarmouth. And there are 2 men, the farmer, Mr. Cheesacre, and Captain Belfield, and Steve has talked about them. They both want to get into Aunt Greenough's... They're both interested in Mrs. Greenough and her niece, Kate. And Mrs. Greenough is a fascinating character, as Steve talks about. But I just loved the humor of the rivalry between these two, and Mrs. Greenough. Aunt Greenough's reaction was priceless. Mr. Cheesacre is having his annual dance on the beach, picnic and dance on the beach, and how ridiculous is it to have a dance on the beach, and it's described in all its glorious ridiculousness. Mrs. Greenough had been prejudiced against Captain Belfield because Mr. Cheesacre had gotten to her first and bad-mouthed him, even though they're supposedly friends. But she is quite attracted to Captain Belfield when she meets him. So here they are setting up the picnic. I love this paragraph. There's reference in the very end of the last sentence to a washerwoman. So she had been bad-mouthing Captain Belfield a chapter before to her niece Kate, and saying that Captain Belfield was so poor he couldn't afford to pay his washerwoman, and that's what Mr. Cheesacre had told her. So that's the reference at the very end, but the rest stands alone. So here they are setting up for the picnic. There was a great unpacking, during which Captain Belfield and Mrs. Greenough constantly had their heads in the same hamper. I by no means intend to insinuate that there was anything wrong in this. People engaged together in unpacking pies and cold chickens must have their heads in the same hamper. But a great intimacy was thereby produced, and the widow seemed to have laid aside altogether that prejudice of hers with reference to the washerwoman. I love that, and I love the rivalry between him and Mr. Cheesacre. I'd like to read you the whole chapter, but you should read it yourself if you haven't already, because it's just fantastic. I will admit that there was one chapter here that I absolutely hated, and that was the long chapter about the fox hunting. My eyes just glazed over, and I really skimmed that. That's the only thing that I didn't like. I agree with Steve that George Vavasor, that's another cousin, the one that Alice had been romantically involved with until he cheated on her a few years before, but he is her first cousin. I'm quoting Steve directly, that George has at least an air of unpredictable excitement about him, and I agree. I don't hate him. I think he's not a completely nice man, but I see what Alice sees in him, and I'm certainly intrigued by him. Steve said he wishes that Trollope had written a novel about Arabella Greenough, who we just met in that quote, and I agree. I love her. I mean, she's a widow and she's crying crocodile tears, as Steve said. But I love the way he writes about the sexual tension that she encourages. Come here and go away. Come here, go away. I love that. It's so well done. So yes, I hereby call for an Arabella Greenough novel. I like Lady Glencora too. I think I agree exactly with how Steve describes her. She's really interesting. She's also a big flirt, but she's really lively. I don't really like the way she treats Alice, but she's certainly fascinating. So here's something, if Steve is taking requests for topics for future videos, he says that money in this novel, it means something so different from what it does now, it might as well be an alien tractor beam or something. So I would be really interested in Steve, if you are so moved, to tell us more about that. Obviously, money's a big theme in the novel. It is in all of Trollope, but I just think that you could really dazzle us with your insight on that topic. So that might be something at the end as a wrap-up or as we go along, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. I am loving this novel. I'm loving doing it as a read-along with Can You Forgive Steve Donoghue, because he has so much to offer us. And Steve is just so in love with literature, so in love with the books that Steve loves. So it's just a complete and utter delight to see him sharing his insight into a book by his favorite author. I'm just having a whale of a good time. So if you are late to the Can You Forgive Steve Donoghue read-along, you'd have your work cut out for you to catch up, but you could do it. So please join us. And these videos that he's putting out will be available, obviously, in perpetuity, so it's not something you'd have to keep up with live. But anyway, that's all I have to say. I'm rambling now, so I'm going to say thanks for watching.